As part of her dissertation research with the Center for Values-Driven Leadership, Dr. Carolyn Maraist sat down with some of the world's top international peace builders. She shares her findings in this presentation.
I'd like you to imagine for a moment that you're standing outside of a door and you're reaching your hand out to open that door, and you know on the other side of the door is a table. And seated at that table are opposing factions. And they could be opposing factions from a military conflict. They could be from opposing silos within your organization. They could be from your own work unit. They could even be from your personal life. But your goal in going into that room is to be a peace builder and a conflict resolver and someone who can help to bring these groups together. And as you reach your hand out, in that moment, ask yourself, what skills, what resources, and what experience do you bring to that table to help bring these groups together? And that was one of the questions that really motivated me in my research. And so to explore this, I spoke to 8 of the world's top peace builders. 4 of these peace builders are from the United States of America, and 4 of them are from the People's Republic of China. And I chose the People's Republic of China because I lived there for many years, and I have great respect for their culture and their wisdom. And these peace builders do not only have different cultural backgrounds, they also have different perspectives because they come from different roles. So one was an ambassador, one was a former advisor to 5 presidents, one was one of our top international mediators, there were scholars and a diplomat, all different perspectives with a great deal of wisdom and a great deal of experience in conflict resolution. So what I'd like to share with you today are some of the key lessons and takeaways I got from my conversations with these men, in the hope that it will help you the next time you need to be a peace builder or work on conflict resolution. So there are first 4 common areas, 4 things that all these peace builders felt were essential in conflict resolution. So I'd like to tell you about those, and then 3 pieces of advice. So the first thing that they think is absolutely essential is empathy. And this empathy has 2 parts. The first part is your own empathy as a facilitator and being able to feel empathy for all the groups involved. And the peace builders describe this as literally standing in the shoes of the other. And you need to think about this because let's say there's a union and management dispute and you can only really feel empathy for management. You might not be the person to be resolving that conflict. You need to be able to feel it for both sides. The second step, which is much more difficult, is about collective empathy. And this is that you as a facilitator need to be able to create empathy between the 2 opposing groups. Help them to feel empathy for one another. So that's the first factor, it's empathy. And the second is integrity. And you need to have a deep-seated integrity in this process. You need to know what your bottom line is and what you're bringing to the table. You need to wear your integrity on your sleeve because at the end of the day, both sides need to trust you. And a story about integrity from one of our top United States peace builders kind of illustrates this point. And he says, and I remember very distinctly the time period where the civil rights movement was emerging and listening to the speeches by Martin Luther King Jr., what a huge impact those had on me. And the day that he was assassinated, very significant riots broke out in our town of Winston-Salem, and our school was shut for about 3 days. And I was surprised because of the response of some of the classmates who I'd been with for about 5 or 6 months. I mean, I, of course, was the new kid in a really big school, so I wasn't used to it. But you know, when you're new, you talk about sports and other things and not big issues when you're that age. And I was surprised to hear them talk about Martin Luther King Jr. as if he had deserved the assassination. And so I stood up and made a strong statement that I thought he was one of the great leaders of our country. And that precipitated a huge kind of outrage in the middle of the class. And I got called a whole series of names that are not repeatable and was not at all defended by the teacher, who basically asked me to sit down. And this is characteristic of all of the peace builders that I spoke with. And it's this kind of deep-seated integrity that you need to be able to bring when you're trying to help resolve conflicts, because people really do need to be able to trust you. So there's empathy and there's integrity, and the third is works hard. Peace building and conflict resolution is not easy. It's not just a question of creating a sense of camaraderie and everyone shakes hands and then everything's okay. It isn't really about that. You have to do your homework ahead of time, where you really research the situation. You need to do your due diligence, and you need to have a work ethic, which is about dedication and persistence to this cause. And to illustrate this, I'd like to read to you the words of a top Chinese peace builder who grew up during the Cultural Revolution, and after junior high was sent to work in a warehouse. I know I cannot give up and have to work hard. My parents told us, you cannot change the environment, but you can improve yourself. Working conditions were not good at all, and my home was pretty far away from the warehouse. So usually I have to leave home by 6 a.m. in the morning and come back probably 8 p.m. in the evening. But after that, I still spend 2 or 3 hours studying before I go to sleep. And he taught himself, and he passed the first college entrance exam after the Cultural Revolution and got into university. And this level of hard work also characterizes all the peace builders, and they think that it's really, really essential that you bring that to your efforts in this area. So there's empathy, integrity, hard work, and finally skill sets. And the peace builders all emphasize that you need different skill sets for different kinds of conflict resolution. And sometimes it might be educational skill sets, sometimes it might be mediation or negotiation. It's going to depend on the situation. And as a facilitator, you're not expected to have all these skill sets. They can take years to develop and training to develop. But the important thing is that you recognize when other skill sets are needed, and that you bring in someone who truly is neutral with those skill sets and who is perceived to be neutral to help you. So those are the 4 factors that they all think are essential to conflict resolution. And now I'd like to share with you 3 pieces of advice. And the first piece of advice comes from one of our top American international mediators. And he said, before you do any of this, you need to work on yourself. You need to bring yourself as a whole person to this process. You have to know yourself. You have to know your areas of vulnerability and your trigger points. Because if not, you're likely to get pulled in, and you're likely to become ineffective and not neutral anymore. So do that hard work on yourself first. That's the first piece of advice. The second piece of advice comes from a top Chinese diplomat, and he says, when you're at that table, every single person in the room needs to be able to have the chance, with all fairness, to put their concerns out on the table. They have to speak their truth, and their voice needs to be heard, even if somebody else in the room thinks it's trivial. As a facilitator, you need to have that space to get everything out and give everybody that chance. After you do that is when you can begin to work towards common ground and finding common ground, even if it's just a little bit of common ground. So that's the first step, is everyone needs to be heard. And the third piece of advice is related, and that's the importance of communication. And the Chinese stressed the clarity of communication and the transparency of communication. The Americans, interestingly, stress dialogue, particularly a type of dialogue which is called sustained dialogue. And that means having a number of meetings. So given your time frame, if you can, set up as many meetings as possible so that people have the real space to do the emotional work that's involved in the conflict resolution, and that ultimately will lead to a sustained resolution that will last. And finally, both sides really valued listening to what is being said and also to what's not being said. So I hope this is helpful, and I hope the next time you're working on peace building or conflict resolution, all your efforts are successful.